and welcome to today's 18 Group webinar on the potential and pitfalls of large language models and generative AI apps. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at 18 Group and I will be moderating the webinar. Our expert speakers today are Chris Beaver, UK MLRO and Group Compliance Chief Operating Officer at GAM, Sean Hurst, a Principal Regulatory at Smarsh, Rajwal Shref, Gen AI ML Senior Manager at Santander UK, and Suresh Ande, Director, Head of Engineering Global Markets Risk Analytics at Bank of America. I'll ask our speakers to introduce themselves in a moment, but just for you so that you can make the most of today's webinar, to the right of the video, you'll see a screen, a Slido screen, two sections. One is for poll questions. We'll be running 3 polls today, so do please take part in those so that we can gain some understanding of where you are with our topic. And then the second slice that we're on the Slido panel is for your questions. So please put those in there whenever you'd like to, and we'll answer as many as possible. So just add them as we go, and then we'll gather them up and try and answer as many as we can. Enough of me, so let me come to our speakers. And please, Chris, let's get started. And you tell us a little bit about why you're here.
Cool. Thanks, Sarah. So I'm Chris Beaver. As Sarah mentioned, I'm the UK MLRO and Group Compliance COO for GAM. I've been in the financial services industry for about 25 years across different guises. I'm keen to understand a bit more in terms of how the LLM and AI is evolving from a financial services industry in terms of trying to look at how we use that for compliance and regulatory purposes.
Thank you. Sean.
Hi, I'm Sean Hurst. I'm the regulatory advisor at Smarsh, and Smarsh is a company that provides a communications compliance platform for some of the largest banks in the world, and I'm pleased to be able to have a chat about this with everyone.
Thank you. Prajwal.
Hi, everyone. I'm Prajwal Shreyas from Santander UK. I work and lead the data science and machine learning unit in Santander UK. So I'm involved in developing these machine learning models, generative AI models, and putting them into production within our environment. I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Excellent, thank you. And Suresh, please.
My name is Suresh Ande. I have more than 2 decades of experience in software engineering. In technology field, representing software engineering, data analytics, ML and AI space, representing various sectors, financial services, manufacturing, healthcare, insurance, including the companies like Bank of America, ODP Corporation, Medtronic, and Wipro. I'm currently working with Bank of America. Also, the views and opinions expressed in this webinar are my own and does not represent my employer. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed. Lots of expertise and experience in the room, but perhaps that's experience not in AI, but lots of expertise certainly in the room. Let's start with an audience poll. As I mentioned before, you'll be able to see that on your screen. The question is, to what extent is your organization committed to generative AI apps? And while you answer the question, let me come to Sean to set the scene and tell us how he sees the state of play on large language models, or LLMs, and generative AI across capital markets, and perhaps a little bit about how regulators are responding to this kind of new technology.
Absolutely. It surprised me just how quickly it has been embraced. I've worked in banking long before I joined Smarsh, and I spent a long time with some of a very large American bank, and things would move very slowly from a technology perspective, but it's incredible to see just how quickly things like the LLMs are being embraced. And there's a reason for that. They are just so useful from a productivity perspective and just getting a step ahead of the competition. So some of the areas that we're seeing from our customers that people are using these models, algorithmic trading, I think that's kind of the holy grail. If we could get that right, and do that in a compliant way, I think we'll see a lot more of that over the coming years. Risk assessment and compliance, that's our bread and butter, and that's something we've been doing for a long time. Before the current generation of large language models, we've been doing that from a machine learning perspective, but it definitely has elevated it with these large language models. And then you've got things like customer services. we all know what ChatGPT is, and the ability for these models to give you human-like responses really elevates what people are doing in customer services. So those are some of the core areas that I'm seeing. I'd be interested to hear what some of my colleagues are going to say as well from their perspective. But from a regulatory perspective, it's more of the same. I think people are, again, getting ahead of the curve and trying to get ahead of what is happening, because the companies that we're speaking to are embracing these tools so quickly. The regulators also need to make sure that they are staying on top of this, so that these tools are used in a way that is not going to break compliance. And we've definitely seen a good response there. We've seen Rishi Sunak recently talking about large language models as well, and what the government are going to be doing to try and help guide the innovation there, but do it in a somewhat compliant way. So it's been interesting to see. I don't want to talk too long. I could talk all day, but I'd love to hear what some of the others have to say.
Okay, Chris, coming to you from a sort of user perspective, what are you seeing?
Yes, similar to Sean, I think it's the evolution over the last probably 18 months or so, I think, has been kind of almost in overdrive in terms of the speed this is appearing. I think from a regulatory perspective, I think the regulators are responding, and there's lots of different, I think, consultations and communications coming out from different regulators. I think the problem we're going to find with the regulatory response is the same one we generally usually get, is trying to compare which regulator saying what and where are the variances more than anything. But I think the opportunity in the state of play, I think the technology is clearly creating opportunities, and probably more and more of them on a day-to-day basis around it. So I think it's a very exciting period in terms of the technology and what we can do with it. Obviously being very conscious that there are some large pitfalls that come with it if we're not careful.
We'll surely be talking about this later. So, Suresh, how do you see it?
Yeah.
The state of play, I think we can take two case studies here, in my opinion. The first one is Bloomberg. Bloomberg introduced something called Bloomberg GPT. They kind of trained it for like 53 days, and then it's some small team, like 9 software engineers and combination of product engineers and product managers and program managers. What they have done was they were looking at the use case of, like, sentiment analysis, classification, named entity recognition, question answering, and all of that. So they created this FinPile, like kind of 50% of the data is being trained on FinPile, where this financial reporting, like, news, filings, and all of that. So it's based on open source Bloom. So it's kind of, they built it in-house. Now the question is it live yet? It's not yet live, still in experimentation stage. They released it in March this year. But primarily, they're still trying to extend it to the internal code, because of the hallucination problems. And you can take one more case study with respect to Morgan Stanley. So they introduced something called AI at Morgan Stanley Assistant, which is based on like 100,000 research reports fed into that. It's into this OpenAI's enterprise tier. Again, this is more to do with the research analysis, research task, admin tasks. So these are two different case studies where in the financial services, and both of these companies are kind of torchbearers, I would say, than any other company. So yeah, that's my take on that.
Okay, so we have some leaders, perhaps. We'll see as we go along. Okay, that's great. Could we see the poll results, please? And Chris, perhaps you'd like to comment on these. People are involved to a limited extent. What would you say, Chris?
I think that's probably a fair reflection of most of the people I'm talking to around it. I think people can see the benefits around it. I think people are a little bit scared of the technology as well, because it's quite new in some aspects, and I think everybody thinks it's this black box. They don't see what the rules are. I'm not sure that's actually the case. So I think people are dipping their toes in and trying to see, okay, how can I use this around that? I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think having a look at it in terms of trying to invest in it now, because I think the efficiency gains and the benefits are there, but it doesn't surprise me that it's kind of to a limited extent more than anything, because it's going to take time for people to get used to using the technology as well.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Chris. And I'm going to stay with you. And on a point you just mentioned, why should FIs be investing in and implementing these technologies now? Obviously, as you said, there's some uncertainty, but why now?
I think it's the opportunity. I think the large language models have taken the technology to a much greater place. Historically, you could do what you could do, you just couldn't do it on the scale you can do it now, in terms of the way the models are ramped up and the ability that they give you to look at large amounts of data, which is never before. And the cases we're looking at, there are really clear efficiencies and benefits, both from a risk and an operational efficiency perspective from there. A couple of the ones we're looking at is it's actually bringing a lot of the process controls which are built at the end of the process much earlier in the process. So we're finding efficiencies are getting cleared out along the way because we're not seeing iterations of documents going back and forth, and it's very easy to program the tool to look at and go, okay, we want to apply this new methodology to it, and overlaying it. But it's taken time to get used to it from that sense. But I think the benefits and the opportunities are why people should be looking at the technology. Is going to continue to evolve, and you'd hope only get better around it. So I think getting in now and starting to look at it now, you're going to get a much better view in terms of how this can help your organization.
Okay, thank you. Sean, why invest now and implement now?
I agree a lot with what Chris is saying there. I'll go back to something that Suresh mentioned earlier about JPMC coming out with their chatbot for their traders. That got announced, and within a week, 3 of our customers were already investigating how they could use it as well. And obviously, we're a communications platform, so they came to us to see how they could do it in a compliant way. If there is trading advice potentially going out, then they need to be able to track those communications. But you can see just how beneficial something like that is. If you can take a plethora of data and have it at your fingertips in a way that makes sense and that you can get to very quickly, it makes everything far more efficient and far more productive, and you're going to be able to do better by your clients as well. So I think people are seeing why they should be looking at these large language models. But I think what we are going to be seeing is more of what are the other benefits that it can bring. I mentioned a few in the beginning that potentially we're looking at, but there's so much more. Just the general productivity. Forget about financial institutions specifically, but just general companies using something like Copilot, Microsoft's Copilot, it changes everything. I spent such a large part of my career in meetings and putting together notes and, PowerPoint presentations. If I'm able to use something like Copilot to streamline that, or even just do it for me, that frees me up to do things that I should be doing. I shouldn't be doing that sort of stuff. I should be doing things that I'm going to bring real value to the company. And I think just those basic functionalities that we're going to get out of these tools, that's where the real benefit of them are going to be. But yeah, from a more specific perspective, industry specific perspective, we're going to see a lot more use cases coming out, things that we can't even imagine right now.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And bringing you in, Parajwal, please would you describe both LLMs and Gen AI and how they fit together? And are there some LLMs that are better for the financial sector than others?
Yeah, that's a very valid question. Generative AI is a very broad term, it refers to speech, text, image, etc. Okay, all of these areas will have generative AI built within them in the near future. But when you're referring to a LLM or a large language model, it's very specific to text data. Here, the models are built so that it can understand and interact in a human-like language format. Okay? So I would say LLM is a smaller category within the broad category of generative AI. Okay? When we are thinking about LLM for financial services, there are certain models which are more specific to financial services, so like the one Suresh mentioned regarding Bloomberg GPT, okay, because it's been trained specifically for financial textual data. Okay. However, I wouldn't say one model is better over the other. I would say you need to think about the use case, test out the particular model for your particular use case, and then come to an assessment of which model is best suited. For example, if you're using something like a customer service bot, you may be able to use a GPT-3 or GPT-4 model to to answer that particular use case. But if you're thinking about financial statement analysis, then something like a Bloomberg GPT would be very beneficial. Okay, so it is a use case by use case specific that the models will need to be assessed. But in summary, large language models are advanced models for language understanding, while generative AI focuses on creating new content. I think there will be a lot of synergy where you're getting a lot of different large language models, but they're broadly can be used for within the Gen AI space.
Okay, great. Chris, what would you add to that?
I would completely agree. I think the interesting part where I've been looking at this is it's probably even more specific to the process you're undertaking within financial services. So I've been looking at a surveillance LLM versus a marketing or financial promotion LLM, and they're completely different languages they're looking at in terms of the context of what's being said. So you couldn't use one over the other. So I think people have, to the point that was made, I think understanding your user case and what you're trying to do is going to be critical, because these aren't generally, it isn't software you can just apply in any circumstance. It's going to be very specific to start with in terms of the process you're looking to do and control around that. I would imagine over time they'll become a bit more generic, and also I think the point, if you're doing a generic process, you can probably use one, but I'm finding it's very specific to the process you're trying to support at the moment. Don't get me wrong, it does it very well from what we've seen, but you can't mix and match a lot of these models into different processes, which is what you wouldn't expect to happen anyway.
Okay, so very much almost a traditional approach to identifying your use case very carefully and then looking for matching solutions. Absolutely. Okay, that's great.
Yeah,
So, sorry,
I
was just going to jump in.
The interesting part. Please do, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and things are moving so quickly. If we saw what was announced yesterday or the day before, creating your own GPTs, right? I mean, that was announced recently. Creating your own models, like submodels within these models, things are moving so quickly. It's not even something I would have imagined was going to be here this week. It wasn't part of my conversation today, but it's things like that just move along so quickly. These conversations are live while we're having them, right?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So then not the traditional model where you have time to do it, you have to keep on top of everything at the same time. Would you say, Sean, is it going to be possible for people? I know it's always difficult when new technology arrives. It's one thing today, one thing tomorrow, then it's regulated. Will it be possible to keep up?
I don't know how you guys do it, Prawal and Chris and Suresh. I don't know, you've got your day job and then you have to keep on top of all the stuff going on. Big part of my job is trying to keep on top of this, and I can't do that completely. There's just so much happening, and it just seems to be expanding incredibly quickly. But it's an exciting time.
It certainly is. And with that, let's come to our next audience poll. And it asks about applications. It is what Gen AI application offer the most value for your organization? And you'll see quite a long list. If you're having trouble, just refresh your Slido poll area on the screen. Quite a long list, so please tick as many of the boxes as you would like to, and as are appropriate to your firm in terms of what you're using Gen AI for. And while you're doing that, I'm going to come back to Sean, who mentioned some of these kinds of applications earlier and how he sees these developing and sort of being augmented as we go along.
So I'll take it back to the simple aspect of this, which is the simple productivity tools, right? Today, email is ubiquitous. At one point, email was something new. It was, hey, have you got email? Today, you don't even question that. Everybody has email. And I think we're going to get to a point where things like Copilot or these virtual assistants are going to be just run of the mill, and everybody's going to have them. And there's a reason for that, because it just does help with productivity. It really does take you to that next level of freeing you up to do things that you should be spending time on. So I definitely see that as an immediate current use case. It's maybe not the most exciting, but that's definitely there. From another perspective, if we're talking about compliance, because that's my world. When we talk about surveillance, when we look at things like supervision, it's always been a difficult task in any compliance organization. And using these new tools or methods, these large language models, and Chris said it before, it's not something that's really new. It's something that just enables us to work with much bigger data sets more efficiently, right? These transformers that are now in these large language models, and that they're able to just accelerate everything we're able to do, and it makes it more accessible. And we're seeing that is really elevating what we're able to do from a surveillance perspective. Reducing false positives, doing things like that sentiment analysis that was mentioned earlier. We've been doing sentiment analysis for a long time, but you have to limit what sort of sentiments you're looking for across which languages. Now, we don't really see those limits. Those limits are no longer there as much as they used to be. So it definitely, the current use cases are pretty much the same as they always have been. It's just now getting so much better.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Raj, well, building on what you were saying before about the different instances for different cases, what sort of use cases are you seeing here?
I do agree with what was mentioned by Sean. The use cases are more or less the same, but the speed at which we are able to implement them and the extensive nature of how they are being utilized is completely new. For example, some of the low-hanging fruits that can be immediately utilized in a financial service organization is customer support. Okay, customer support is a critical part of most of the financial service organizations, but it requires a lot of man hours, a lot of manual effort, which can be automated using GPT. Okay, there's a lot of operational automation, such as textual data, PDF documents, etc., which can be read, summarized, and at least the first level of review can be performed by the model, with more sophisticated and insight-driven inputs being fed by human beings at a later stage. So human in the loop is a key thing for the early stages, because you don't want to have an autonomous use cases at this point. Okay. Apart from that, the assistant-based use cases are plenty. You can have an assistant for each individual area in your bank or each individual sector. Okay. And the final one is reporting. Reporting is the holy grail in financial services. If you can help automate parts of reporting using LLM, that will phenomenally change things. Yeah.
Okay. Suraj, what do you see as useful?
I would divide the use cases. Currently, what people are using or companies are using into two. One is the code generation. Second one is text generation. I think if you broadly divide the use cases into they all fall under either of these categories, which are actually generating the revenue for any of these companies that are selling these chatbots. Now, code generation, we already spoke, Sean spoke about that, so the Copilot and all, everyone knows it. And in terms of the text generation, it takes multiple subdivisions under that. You can use it for financial advisory. You can feed all of these research reports into the chatbot, and then you can ask questions like, what is the outlook on the Fed rate hike? How do I open an IRA for a client? So the financial advisor need not spend hours or even so much amount of time. He can just get to the results immediately based on the input given by these chatbot. The same thing with the customer service representative. If he or she has to go through the full manual to answer a question, he or she doesn't need to go through that. Chatbot can help that question and then summarize that and give it, here is the answer. Same thing with the digital marketing people. If they want to create novel content in terms of the pictures or images or even text, they can always take the help of this text generation. So I think broadly speaking, that's how the use cases are driven. And if you say for the regulatory environment, like where we are in the financial services, we can extend that here and see what kind of regulations are there, and then how our internal processes with respect to surveillance as a supervision are aligned with that. So basically, you're trying to compare the text versus text. You have the text that is all the regulations and all those, and then at the same time you have internal processes. Again, there is a text, so you can try to compare and see how they are aligned. And these kind of LLMs would help in those kind of use cases as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let's see what our audience thinks, if we could please, where they see particular use of Gen AI. And Sean, would you like to comment on that?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I think that's the most practical use cases, which is why we're seeing fraud detection right at the top there. It's pretty interesting. I'm surprised regulatory compliance isn't further up on the list, but yeah, this corresponds with what we've been talking about. KYC is one thing we haven't actually mentioned, but it is a very, very good use case of this. Being able to pull out some reports. We have so many systems, or financial services institutions have many systems that contain data that is useful from a KYC perspective. Being able to put that into a large language model and interrogate it from a single point of view, it's going to be hugely useful. And then we've mentioned here about reports, which I would say the predictive analytics is very useful for that. Yeah, definitely. I am surprised the regulatory compliance is so far down the list. And maybe it's because people haven't really seen what can actually be done with the generative AI piece. They're used to the more traditional AI, which was more machine learning in the past to help with detection, things like that. But you're going to see some very interesting stuff coming out around these LLMs when it comes to regulatory compliance. So yeah, that's quite interesting.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Sean. And coming back to you, Chris, what guidance would you offer on building or buying Gen AI apps? We've kind of touched on both, talked about both. What would your advice be there?
Probably to repeat, I think, which a couple of people have said earlier, I think it's being clear on the purpose and your user case. What do you want to achieve from the tool? I don't think that's unique to LLMs or AI. I think that's any system integration. I think it's probably a lot, well, it's not a lot more, but it is probably more important now because the tools have so much ability to process data. So I think in being very clear on what you're trying to achieve and what good looks like, or what your expected outcome, because if you don't know that, I don't think you're ever going to get to where you want to get to on this. So that's probably the key piece. I think in terms of build or buy, that's going to be an organizational preference around it. I work for an organization that I'd probably argue will buy most of our technology because we're fairly small. But some of the organizations I've worked for before will clearly build some of theirs because they've got the resources. So I think that's going to be an organization and a by organization. And also in terms of what your core competencies are as an organization as well, because I think that's going to be quite important, because you don't want to be suddenly building stuff which isn't kind of critical to what you do as an organization, but it will happen, sadly.
Okay, thank you. And Sean, with your generalist hat on, how do you see that? And if an FI is building apps, what skills and resources are they looking for? And if they're choosing to buy, what should they be looking for from a vendor?
And I'll kind of answer what Chris was answering earlier. You might think because I work for a software company that I'm going to say you should buy, but I don't believe that is the case. There is a mix, and I think there is definitely a use case for both. It's just making the right decisions about which part you're building, which part you're buying, right? There's certain things that you cannot risk putting in the hands of internal staff, because number one, they might not have the exposure to the general market and what other companies are doing. So it's quite useful to have that insight from a vendor. And the other side as well is a lot of companies don't want to have to keep up with what's happening out there. If you again take what we do from a communications perspective, we are capturing communications data for about 100 different channels of communication. I don't think a bank wants to spend time on 100 different channels, or they might not use all 100, but they don't want to have to even work with Microsoft Teams and figure out what API changes have happened last week. So there's certain use cases where it definitely is something you should be looking to buy, but don't discount building. And when it comes to building, number one, prioritize security and compliance, right? You're working for a bank. You need to make sure that things are secure and compliant. One of the biggest challenges that people had with LLMs, with choosing to adopt it or to even allow certain things like ChatGPT usefulness in the workplace, was the fact that data is sitting out in the public, right? So from a information security perspective, they were concerned about leaking data, and actually there were some cases where data was leaked. So building in-house, making sure that your data is compliant, make sure your data isn't leaving the organization, that's hugely important. Investing in quality data. So one thing was mentioned on that poll before was about one of the use cases was generating test data, right? Generating data that can be used for these sort of tools. Absolutely, that's a huge use case for us and for anyone in technology. Creating good test data is very important. Being able to use an LLM or generative AI to be able to produce that quality data to be able to do your testing with, that's a massive use case. So, make sure that you are, number one, investing in quality data to be able to train up your models, but also using some of these models to be able to generate some data to do the testing with. And then, from a regulatory perspective, because now we're looking at this, yes, you've got to go in and you're building these applications, make sure they're compliant. What does it mean to be compliant, right? I would take a look at what the regulators are saying. The FCA are really on it at the moment. And it's not just the FCA. There's a lot of other organizations that are giving advice around how to look at this. We have obviously some real issues when it comes to LLMs, hallucinations. We have issues with bias. That's a massive problem. So you've got to look into what's actually happening with that and what the independent assessments are out there for these models around those sort of circumstances, and then see what the regulators are saying as to when should you or shouldn't you be able to use these large language models. So I think the bottom line here is just do a ton of research and keep on top of what is going on out there. Don't assume, hey, we're going to go with AWS. They've got some fantastic stuff with Bedrock and things like that. We're all good. We're going to run that and everything's fine for the next 3 years. You've got to keep on top of it. You've got to keep seeing what innovations are out there, and what challenges there might be with the stuff you've chosen to use.
Okay, which smooths along nicely into our next poll question, which asks, what are the challenges of implementing generative AI apps at your organization? There's quite a long list, so once again, please tick as many of the boxes as you like. I think you may be experiencing problems with submitting questions, but please don't worry, we are actually getting them, even if you think we're not. So please do keep sending your questions. So meantime, please do vote in this poll. And while you do that, let me come back to Prajwal. How do you see the limits and challenges of these types of apps, and how can these problems be resolved if they can? Prajwal, you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
There are a few limitations and challenges on adoption of generative AI, and I think that will create a hurdle for most of the financial services institutions. The first thing is explainability. Most of these large language models have been trained on vast amounts of data, and there's no clear explainability of why a particular outcome has been generated by the model. Okay, especially if you're utilizing some in use cases where you need to explain the decision of a model to the regulator or the customer. Explainability is a challenge. However, there's been active research in this area, and I'm sure in a few months to years, there will be tools to explain the outcomes of these models that will be available in the public domain. So I think that's one key challenge. Okay. Apart from that, there are some wider challenges. Some of the models have been trained using copyrighted information. Because of this, there may be illegal and ethical challenges for utilization of the model. Okay. So while how do we overcome this? So the key thing which I would say is focus on more simpler use cases where there's no new data being generated, but it's just summarizing and given internal data. Okay, such as a Q&A bot, for example, or some kind of automation. Okay, so such that copyrights and won't be an issue. Okay, and additionally, implement any content filters, copyright checks, and fact-checking mechanisms into your Gen AI tooling, so that it would make it more ethically and legally safe.
Okay, that's great. Suresh, where do you see the challenges here, and can they be resolved? I think some of them we've talked about, things like bias. It's very difficult to resolve something like that. Data quality always counts, but what would you say here?
The major challenges are with respect to data security and privacy. I mean, there is hallucination. I think Sean touched on it. Data security and privacy. I'll just take an example of the recent, not recent, like Samsung's data leak. It talked, right? Like I said, the code base was exposed to the chatbot. Now, well, the question is like, how the code while in transit was encrypted, while at rest also encrypted. So what is the data leak we are talking about? That's primarily while the data is in use, it's leaked. Basically, anyone who has access to compromised OS access and all of that, or even the root access. They would be able to see the data when the data is going in between CPU, memory, and GPUs. So that is one aspect. So we need something like encryption of data in use. There is research progressing in that direction with confidential computing and doing the encryption at the enclave level. The second aspect is with respect to the adversarial attacks or toxicity. So once the data goes there, especially with the Samsung's proprietary code base, it sits in the model. You cannot make it unlearn it. It just sits there with all the weights and biases. So you can trick it, give it a prompt, and then add some suffixes and things like that, and then it will spit it out. Like you can always, there is another study where they give a prompt like how to create a bomb, and then put in like various suffixes with special characters. It will give you the complete details. So that is the second aspect. So one is the encryption of data in use. Second one is adversarial attacks. The third one, which I want to touch, is like AI cannibalism. In the sense, AI generated content boom, both AI authored novels, AI generated code have been like, mushrooming like crazy, right? In the past recent 1 or 2 years. So what happens is these LLMs try to scoop up this AI content. So it becomes like a feedback loop. So all the AI models learn from the content that was itself AI generated, resulting in a gradual decline in the output and quality. So it's very difficult to differentiate between the real information and AI generated content. So you would see that in the next few years when GPT-5 and 6 come, they would be potentially get trained or inadvertently get trained on the AI generated code as well. So those are a couple of aspects that I would like to touch on in terms of the challenges.
Okay, thank you very much. I think those are acknowledged, but again, as you say, it's very difficult to tell now at the beginning where we go next. Chris, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think the key bit from a kind of the user perspective, I think was touched on by both the gentlemen, which is the validity of the data. I think that's the bit we're worried about in terms of whether that's using a more of a public tool like ChatGPT-4 and you've got copyright aspects and literally the quality of what it's returning. We've seen stuff that's just not real around it. So putting those into your business practice come with some real concerns. But if we then look at some of the private models, again, it's the validity of the data, whether that's the data that's been used to test it, the data we're feeding it on an ongoing basis, because the importance of an LM tool, it's only going to be as good as the data you put into it in reality. So this is kind of the key piece we're trying to focus on from a user experience.
Okay, thank you all, and let's have a look at the poll results. And Rajwal, would you like to comment on these? As it's your experience among users, these are the challenges our organizations who are listening to us today are finding.
I think I do agree with the lack of understanding across the organization. Machine learning was a new thing, but on top of it, you have generative AI. So there's a bit of educational approach that needs to be taken where people kind of get up to date with what's happening. Okay. The shortage of skills, regulatory compliance, are the same problems with everybody is facing, I guess. Data privacy, I think that's a key thing, especially if you're using third-party hosted models, which are not even based in UK. So I think I agree with most of the things on the top. Model explainability, again, that's a point which I touched upon. Definitely agree with those. Limited business buy-in and/or budget. I think that is something which can be addressed by building a POC and kind of building a robust business case on savings that can be generated through use of models. So that's a challenge that can be addressed.
Okay, thank you. Sean, are you pleased to see the regulatory compliance element a bit higher up there?
Yeah, absolutely. I am very surprised, though, that the bottom one is model explainability and trustworthiness. That's probably the biggest topic that gets approached with us all the time. We actually have an employee that wrote a book on AI explainability because we believe that is hugely important. And that's partially because our customers are telling us how important that is. I think you can't have true compliance. You can't answer the regulators unless you do have some explainability around what the models are doing. So now I'm quite interested to see at the bottom. But I guess this is about prioritizing where the biggest issues are, right?
Yeah.
No, I think it looks good.
In many ways, yes. Yes, they do. There's not to show sort of extent of it's trying to get going and the challenges of just getting everybody behind it, which is a good start in its way. So thank you all for that. And let's take a break for some audience questions from, quite a few here. So I'm going to put this one back to you, Sean, and it says, please would the panel separate the hype from the reality of Gen AI?
Wow. I've been asked that a few times as well. You know, and it's a tough one because obviously I'm a technology person first and foremost, right? A lot of my work is around compliance. From a technology perspective, I don't see this as magic. I see it as something that is very logical and practical. The way it's been implemented is incredible, and just how quickly we're getting some real results from this technology is amazing. But there is some hype to it. The quality of the outputs are a little bit challenging. It's very easy to actually see when something is generated by something like ChatGPT. People can recognize by just having a quick look and seeing the type of language that's used. It tends to look a bit samey, and you know, the same cadence that others have had. So the quality of the outputs, as amazing as it was when we first started using it, because it was something brand new, now we're starting to see, wait, we can start seeing a pattern here. So that kind of takes the shine off a little bit. But I don't think that'll be for too long, right? We're going to see some major developments when GPT-5 comes along, or any of these other models that are going to come along that take it to the next level. It's going to be indistinguishable from human sort of output. But yeah, right now, I don't think it's... I think in general, we're having a little bit of a tech bubble right now with this, which nobody wants to hear, tech bubble. If we remember the 2000s. But I think we are having a little bit of an AI tech bubble right now, which people are on that hype train. People are a little bit more cautious than maybe they were in the early 2000s with the web applications that were coming out. But there still is just, there's new software like every 5 minutes that's coming out, a new tool, a new way of doing things. So I'd like to see that hype die down a little bit so that we can get through the noise and get to the real stuff. We already have established some big players out there with OpenAI, for example. Amazon are doing some interesting things as well. Google as well. I think they get pushed aside a little bit, but they're doing some very interesting things too. Being able to see or to know which isn't hype and which is, that's going to be what's going to be probably a bit more of a challenge over the next 6 months to a year still. But yeah, I think it'll calm down.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Suresh, one for you here, I think. It asks, where does the panel expect to see failure and bad outcomes of generative AI in the short term and perhaps long term?
The bad outcomes, there are a couple of things, right? Okay, so one thing I'll touch on is drift. Like there's a study where they have done with GPT 3.5 and 4 with the same kind of questions or same kind of input in March 2023 and June 2023. What happened was there was significant drift in terms of the model's output in between March and June. Well, what would have contributed? If you're looking for a consistent result set, you won't be getting it. Like even for code generation, the level of accuracy or accuracy scoring dipped for these two models from May to June. So that is one aspect in terms of the drift that we need to be careful about. And also in terms of the context windows. I mean, I think yesterday, this OpenAI announced like they can increase the context windows to 128,000. Right now, there's the biggest one is with Anthropic, like 100,000 tokens you can give. But again, the problem is if that level of context is given, the studies showed that have shown that like only the beginning, the very start and very end context will have better performance, whereas anything in the middle of the input context will not have that much of accuracy. So those are the things. And then the third aspect with respect to where it's going wrong is with respect to the regulations, and then how they're going to be transparent about what they're training on. See, for instance, the copyright data. If you see Adobe Firefly, they are providing the indemnity to anything that they are doing with their chatbot or with their application. It is just because they have trained it on non-copyrighted data. So all of the other companies are also following the suit. So, but again, if you don't have that level of indemnity, it's very difficult for any digital marketing people to use that level of that kind of application. So, I mean, these are a couple of things I touched on. The main thing is EU AI Act, European Union AI Act is coming up. So hopefully by that time, we would overcome this waning transparency in terms of copyrighted data, in terms of inadequate disclosure, and things like that. So, yeah.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much indeed. And Chris, another regulatory question, actually. It says, how could regulations such as GDPR be used to inform generative AI apps on data privacy? Is it something you've looked at as well?
Not in a massive amount of detail. And I think the reason being GDPR is usually looking at personal data around it. Most of the applications we've been looking at, or I've been looking at, are on kind of financial services data. Yes, there's personal data within there, but we'd be looking at a ring-fenced environment. We wouldn't be sending it out the door. I think it's a very valid consideration if you're using, again, the public sources like ChatGPT, etc., in terms of how they're using the data, and then you pass it onwards from there. But to be honest, I think if you're using any of these tools and you're looking at personal data, you need to be really careful in terms of what's getting moved to different places. But I don't think this is exasperating that problem in any way. I think it's a problem that already exists. I don't think this makes it any worse.
Okay.
I'll just add to that. Sorry, GDPR is something that I work on quite extensively. I think this is where data classification is going to really come in. People have had challenges with that, well, for as long as I've been in this industry. But making sure that your data is properly classified is going to be hugely important now more than ever, because you're going to be using that data to train up these models. If you've got data classified incorrectly, if you've got personal data sitting inside some data that you haven't classified properly, and that's going to be used to generate some content or to train up these LLMs, that means that data is inside those LLMs. You can interrogate it, and that data could be surfaced where maybe it shouldn't be, right? So data classification, going back to basics, maybe using AI to do the classification, who knows? But I think data classification is going to be huge, getting your data in order to be able to train with quality data.
Okay, thank you. And Rajah, one for you. As a user, this one asks, is there a possibility AI models set up and maintenance, it will simply be too expensive to roll out at scale?
What we have seen is, even from the yesterday's announcement, ChatGPT is now 3 times lower the cost than what it used to be. OpenAI is reducing cost. So there will be a bit of competition war among all the major providers, and we would see the cost of running a GPT model will be drastically reduced with time. Okay, there will be some amount of investment which will be required from each of the financial service organizations to make sure that they maintain and manage their current GPT models as and when they put it into production. But the overall cost and the benefit that you would get will be outweighed. Benefit will outweigh the cost. So I don't see that being a problem in the future. Okay,
and you'll be able to scale.
Yeah, I think one of the few use cases that we have seen where they have used internal data using RAG functionality allows you to scale the outcomes of GPT. Okay. Now again, when you want to scale a particular process, you need to have people, process, and technology to support it. So provided you have these 3 from the start, you should be able to scale this GPT across your organization quite easily.
Okay, thank you for that. And the last one, which I'm going to put to both Chris and Sean, I think, to see the different views here. And Chris, it asks, how will generative AI change the workforce and organization of FIs?
I think the skill sets in particular, but I think this has been an ongoing conversation within kind of the legal and compliance world for a number of years as machine learning and other pieces have come in, where I think having an understanding of, you can't just be a lawyer anymore, you need to have an understanding of how trading works, you need to understanding of how coding works, etc. So interesting, where we're looking at recruitment, etc., we're not looking at just traditional legal and compliance skills. We're looking at people who have operational skills. technology backgrounds, etc., around it. So I think the makeup of your team and the understanding and knowledge of people from a base perspective, I think is going to move, and it probably already has done, I think, in a lot of organizations. So I think that's going to be the big change from a people perspective.
Okay. And Sean, when you were out there talking to clients about LLMs and generative AI, do you talk this as part of the conversation? What are people saying?
The only thing I can really add to what Chris said is, don't worry about your job. So many people are so worried that this means we're going to lose jobs, we're going to lose these roles. Don't worry about that. Your role's going to evolve, right? These skill sets that you have are still useful. They will be evolving. They'll be changing what is going to be required of you on a day-to-day basis. Think about it more positively. It's going to, in general, it's going to help you do your job more efficiently. It's going to help you actually do the things that you should be focusing on, right? Rather than the mundane things. It can help you be more accurate at what you're doing. It's going to mean you're going to have more data at your fingertips, right? That, I think, over the next 6 months to a year, maybe 2 years, we're going to see some shifts where organizations are going to downsize potentially in certain places because they don't think that they need the number of staff. But on the flip side, you're going to see them increasing the number of staff they need in other areas, right? I think Chris has it right there. It's just going to be changing, right? Things are going to be changing. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just keep up to date, right? Keep up to date on what's going on, and don't be scared of the technology.
And probably just to add to that,
Yeah.
Sarah, sorry, just one last point. I think the two business cases we're looking at the moment in this space are eliminating low value tasks. Interesting, when I talk to the guys in the team who do that tasks, they can't wait to get rid of them and do something more interesting in terms of what we're looking at. That's not going to be a case across the board, but I think there's a lot of low value administrative repetitive tasks we all do in organizations, and I think that's probably your starting point, because that gets the feel good factor if you can start eliminating some of those as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Very interesting. Thank you. So thank you to our audience for your questions and to our speakers for their answers. It's time to move back to my questions. And I would like to come, if I may, to you first, Chris, to talk a little bit about the expectations of benefits in terms of operational and business basis, and what the benefits could be. We've talked about that, so could sum that up. And then also let's look at the other side with the penalties if you don't get it right.
Yeah, so I think, as I just mentioned, I think the big benefits that we've identified initially are going to be administrative, repetitive tasks, where you need to apply a simplistic rule set across something repeatedly. There's a lot of operational efficiencies and I think control benefits from it. The consequences of getting it wrong, I don't know how much regulators are going to fine on things like this, etc., but I think it's going to fall in the space we've all fall into. If you put in a piece of technology and you code it wrong and it's not working correctly, there will be consequences to it. Those consequences will depend on how serious it is and what you're doing and what you're looking at, etc. So, but the regulators will be all over this. They already are in reality. So I think anybody who's putting this in and doesn't understand what they're putting in, even at the basic level, then get that understanding quickly, because the regulators will understand what you're putting in.
Okay. Rajwa, where do you see the benefits and the penalties?
I think I completely agree with what Chris has said. There's a lot of operational benefits to be driven from GPT. But apart from that, what it will lead to is personalization and customer engagement. So if you can drive higher level of personalization and better customer engagement, that's going to improve your brand value in the market. Okay. And it's going to increase customer satisfaction with your product. Okay. So I think those are the key outcomes that the GPT can drive in the next stages. Again, if you get it wrong, reputational and trust damage would be high. So you have to build this new technology, but with guardrails around it, and ensure that it doesn't go beyond the parameters it's designed for. I think that's the key one.
Okay, thank you. Suresh, what would you add there in terms of the benefits and the problems if you get it wrong?
Well, there is always this clash of vested interests in between creativity and accuracy. Financial services industry is primarily based on having accuracy in every aspect. Now, the problem with the LLMs is they're not accurate. You have some level of probabilistic percentages, like 80%, 90% accurate. So again, it depends on, like, obviously the productivity increases are always there with the code generation, text generation, and things like that. But again, the level of accuracy matters a lot. Like if something like a financial advisor uses some kind of summarization, buy this, sell this, and something like that, if something is wrong in that, how accurate it is, even if it is 80% accurate, it may not work. So, and then obviously you should be answerable to the regulator saying, like, why is this wrong? So the penalties, obviously we have to see what the regulators come up with, but main thing is the reputational damage. Now, one thing I would like to say is Gen AI or these LLMs, they are not built for accuracy. They are built for creativity primarily. But again, we have to get these business use cases where you fit in between this creativity and accuracy, and then start using them.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And coming to my final question today, I'd like to ask all the speakers to provide some guidance for practitioners who are working on LLMs and Gen AI. And Chris, could you kick this one off, please?
Yeah, but probably the thing, if anybody's heard me speak before, it's the thing I always say is, but be sure on what you're trying to solve. Be very clear what you're trying to solve, because if you're not, the technology is not going to massively help you. You need to be clear, I think, is probably the key bit I would say to people. Okay, thank you. Prajwal.
I think building a POC with generative AI is very easy. The more difficult thing is putting it into production, okay, and ensuring it will work accurately. So I would say focus on that. Build a quick POC, but make sure you get it right in production.
Okay, Suresh?
I think I've seen a lot of people trying to solve, like they have to look at the problem and then how to solve the problem using the technology available. Not the other way around, where I have this technology available, what problem I can solve with this kind of Gen AI LLM tools. And with this approach, I've seen a lot of companies like moving fast and breaking things. But they have to look at the problem, and then they have to see what kind of solution they need, and then see what kind of technologies are available in the Gen AI realm, not the other way around. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Sean, some final words here from you, please.
Just research, research, research. There's so much information out there. Keep on top of it. Try and keep on top of it. And also don't neglect training. Right. So for all the organizations that might be listening to this, training is key no matter what you're doing. Right. And especially with this, you need to train up your staff. They need to understand what the stuff is, even if it's not the people implementing, if it's the people that's going to be on the end of it using it, they need to be trained up on what it is and what it isn't.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sean. And thank you very much to all our speakers for sharing their experience and expertise. Thank you to Smash for sponsoring today's webinar. Just before we close, a few 18 Group events coming up that may be of interest to you. On Thursday this week, we'll host a webinar on real-world data governance, practical strategies for data ownership. And looking at events, you can sign up for next week's 16th of November RegTech Summit in New York. I think you can see some of the topics which are going to be talked about there, and indeed generative AI and LLMs is certainly one of them. And looking further into the future, our next Data Management Summit in London will be hosted on the 14th of March in 2024 in Canary Wharf. And again, generative AI will be part of the conversation. So I hope that we'll be able to move forward a little bit and talk about how the industry is going at that time. So that said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Chris, Sean, Prajwal, and Suresh. And thank you to all of you who have taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we always appreciate your views, and they will help us to inform our products going forward. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.